everybody. Welcome to This Week in Innovation. On today's pod, we catch up with Chris Chib, VP Global Strategic Accounts at Ripcord, to discuss his company and the role it's playing in digitizing analog data. Ripcord was started at NASA in 2014 with the goal to make the world paperless. Ripcord uses vision-guided robots, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to capture and organize information living on paper. They estimate there's 5 billion banker's boxes of paper in the U.S. just asking to be digitized and used. It's a fascinating conversation. Join us, give it a listen, and let us know what you think. Hey, Brian, how was vacation? Oh, welcome back, by the way. Welcome back to work. How was the vacation?
It was awesome. It was awesome, Jeff. Glad to be back here again. Had a great time of rest and relaxation. And I'm back today and also super excited today. We have an awesome guest, Chris Chib. We love to talk to Chris more about sales growth in startup companies, as well as some of the 5 forces we cover. Chris has been involved in a lot of these areas, and we'll have an exciting discussion today and looking forward to it.
Oh, sounds great.
Thank you, Jeff and Brian. Yeah, my name's Chris Chib. I am today the VP of Sales for a startup in Silicon Valley known as...
Chris, great to have you, Chris. And Chris, we love to tell us a little bit about Ripcord, right? And then the value proposition you bring to the industry. And also give us a little bit of background about yourself as well. And because startups need to have great sales leaders, and you're one of them. And we will dwell into more questions in that area as well. But for now, tell us more about Ripcord and your value proposition and how you change this landscape of the industry.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Brian. The Ripcord is a young company. We're a young startup. We're about 6 years old. We were extremely ambitious in what we thought we can come to market and do in a space that today is completely dinosaur space. The space is information management, record capture. And specifically, I want to underscore the capture bit of it, because what any of your audience today may know about capture, they know the traditional companies in the space, Xerox, Ricoh, Conduent, et cetera, that just provides imaging services. And prior to my joining Ripcord, I looked at this space as a record. You hit the print button, maybe it's a record, it goes in a folder, goes in a box. I don't know what happens to it after that. I've never worked the record management side of the fence. But what I learned is that it's a completely manual space. And a lot of major technology organizations across ERP solutions or RPA solutions, they put the onus back on the customer, get us the data. We don't care about the paperwork, but get us the data. And so companies are forced to work with a supply chain of vendors, in this case, perhaps a capture vendor or a BPO center like a Ricoh, where they can manually digitize all these documents. And then perhaps they have another vendor that will look at the raw images and then manually, data enter information from these documents. A lot of your downstream workflow and processes are beholden to that data. How do I close my month-end transactions if I'm a retailer selling product to company B? There may be documents that follow that shipment of product that end up needing at a month-end reconciliation with some accounts receivable process. So the management of all the supply chain documents, financial records, legal records, and a few other kind of use cases is what Ripcord sought to automate. And how we came to market to automate it, we actually built the world's first robot, an actual robot. I know we hear the word robot a lot in the industry. In this case, we are using a 4-axis robotic arm powered by a computer vision system and a great deal of AI components and to automate the process of document capture. So what does that mean? That means nobody really went to school or college to be a human staple remover. In this case, we're replacing that job with a machine that I can present a box of paper to, and the machine will prep the documents, scan the documents, and then work through the net effect of classification of these documents, which is really the core of what our customers pay us to do. So we built the world's first automated business process center. That's what Ripcord does.
No, it's perfect. It's perfect, Chris, because what's really interesting about this is that first part of AI and machine learning, because Jeff and I have been talking a lot in this podcast series about the capabilities of what you can do with AI. What can you do with IoT? And how does that affect retail? How does it affect the industry? And we've been putting a lot of focus and thinking around data. But the first step is you have to get the data there, right? Even before the data has to be created. So you are in this first step of actually, bringing data that is not digital, right?
That's right. At Ripcord, we look at the physical documents and we call it analog data. In our case, it's all about the data. You're absolutely right.
Perfect. No, and one of the things about it is like, Chris, because you are in this really interesting market segment of digital transformation, which I think Jeff and I have spoken in the past, which is about a $1.6 trillion market. Huge opportunity. The reason we get super excited about market sizes is not just because they're big dollars and numbers, but it also shows the real problem existing or the need that exists among our customer base. So there is a massive need. And then there is this AI market, which is about 500 billion. So we are in this intersection between these things. And one question I have for you, like how much of data that is still dark data or like data that has not been converted into digital, right? Because AI and everything we have today becomes very powerful once the data becomes digital. How much, just like the dark web, how much of this is, I'm not looking for exact numbers, but from what you've seen, what is your feel?
Just in North America alone, the market data, the research we've done in this industry is that there are billions of boxes of paper sitting in America. And on an annual basis, it's hundreds of millions of boxes that are net created to they're sent to physical storage. Our job at Ripcord is to figure out how do we help drag these legacy companies or large companies into the modern era where they can lean on technologies that Iterate and others bring to market, or DocuSign or something to that effect. And the problem is that these large companies, they still have legacy processes that lean on physical document or sign off, and you can automate a number of those things. But when I think about an industry like banking, for example, one of our clients today in a bank, I think it's, if any of your audience has done a refinance or a home purchase in the last year or two or a few years, you can pretty much negotiate all of the terms of a contract, a lending contract agreement, et cetera. And all that happens today via DocuSign. But the end transaction, the bank, again, doesn't fund that loan until they send a notary to your home or office to get a thumbprint, to get wet signature on 150 documents. That becomes actually an asset. And the bank looks at this physical document as not only evidence of the captured signature and I got all my Patriot Act stuff signed, et cetera, and looked at driver's license and all of the verification that needs to happen there, but they also actually treat this physical packet as an asset. Ripcord will take all of those completed lending documents, digitize to preserve that data, and then we feed that data back into whatever their cloud provider of choice is. This creates a huge library of data. Now, the physical packet can either live its end of life in a cold storage somewhere, but now the bank actually can use all the data from market or region or territory kind of information to understand customer demographic and a lot of other data to measure performance or to measure a variety of things throughout their company. But in this case, the point I'm trying to make is there are still processes out there that involve paper. And that's an example of one of them where we're still finding that paper is king at the end of the transaction. So Ripcord's really born helping companies like banks in doing their digital transformation. But we've got use cases going into retail, and I know maybe a number of your audience may be more in the retail space. And so retail branches certainly use and lean on some of our technology for that support. The other type of use cases that were very familiar to us in this case are a beverage company. A major beverage company here in the United States. They manufacture and create a product, and that product leaves one of their bottling facilities to end up at a customer, a Walmart, a Kroger, a big box store. But that product arrives with a shipping manifest, a bill of lading. When the product arrives to one of those store retail locations, the store manager or shipping receiving person has to sign off, yes, I ordered 42 pallets of whatever this beverage product is, and they have to intake that. The driver in this case, there's still a lot of paper that when the driver gets done with their route at the end of the day, all this documentation needs to get fed into their ERP. So they can reconcile their end-of-month billing for an accounts receivable process. And that's the enigma where Ripcord lives today. We automate that step, right? I capture all of that document, and to us, it's noise. It's a lot of unstructured and very semi-structured categories of data. Every store that this delivery driver may go to may have a different type of a form. And so there's a lot of complexity here in doing this work in an automated way. We need to train machine learning and AI components to recognize all of the edge cases and nuances of all the different vendors and customers that driver went to see that day. And the core is really about creating high amount of data integrity around these documents so that the finance team can trust this data so they can close their end-of-month books and they can get paid for their service. So in this case, we've helped to revolutionize this particular beverage company's current process. They previously constantly chasing end-of-month closing. There are multiple vendors in the supply chain that all touch a same document or a record at some stage of its life cycle. In this case, Ripcord was able to automate, capture all this document, and then as close to a 24-hour turnaround time, feed all that data back to their ERP. It was a huge savings in terms of spend reduction, in terms of how the efficiency gain, not just in spend. So a lot of different use case examples spanning physical documentation. The bank example I just mentioned is an example of a day 4. This is data that's created net daily, weekly, monthly that we're helping to preserve, to create a library of data that the bank can use for a number of processes downstream. In other categories of data, we're seeing in industries like oil and gas and in energy, we're finding that in some of those spaces, the customer is looking back at data that's nearly 100 years old. That data is still very relevant today and has a high data sensitivity to these organizations that are exploring for oil, right? They're looking for oil. And so in these sort of scenarios, they have tremendous amount of data around onshore and offshore rigs where they actually do exploration for oil. The data in this case lives in graphs, it lives in charts, it lives in acoustic reports, it lives in a variety of different media types. And all that variability is the noise. This is the semi-structured and unstructured categories of data. And when we look back at 100 years of data, a Chevron or a major oil company, let's say, has been doing work since the early 1900s in a region or a territory, that organization's got 100 years of data that's trapped in paper. It's trapped in paper boxes, right? In this industry specifically, it's unique because the geophysicists and other folks that are doing that type of work, they're studying rock sediment that's arguably billions of years old, right? Depending on who you talk to. And in this case, 100 years of data on a billion-year-old rock, that's nothing. That's a very limited, narrow scope of information you have about that area. So in this situation, we're looking also at legacy content, but why that's important to organizations today, they need a trusted library of data that they can point to so that companies like Iterate can help build compelling BI tools and other sort of systems on top of these libraries of data and help them act and transact with that data. So it's great that many of your audience may have a physical archive of documents. The physical archive is really more about compliance. I have to store this paper. I have compliance need to store this paper. Can you do something better with it? Can we take this data and put it make it useful? And that's the space that Ripcord lives in. We want to work with customers that have high value data that they need to transact with that they don't have access to. It's trapped in a box.
And this is super exciting. And just listening to you, I'm already getting very excited. One of the things like Jeff and I have been covering and Solomon as well in some of these prior podcasts is that, traditional organizations, what we mean by traditional organizations is organizations whose offering products or services is not technology. But technology is the key driver to fuel them, right? Mm-hmm. And we've also covered this concept of data being the data. So what's really interesting in here is a lot of the traditional organizations are getting disrupted by startups and new companies. And you have this concept of the death by 1,000 cuts. And there is massive intermediation and disaggregation. And this is happening in finance industry. You're already seeing in banking, right? And the companies are going public. Startups that start 5 years prior are now all are going public. So this is massive growth. But what's interesting, though, is the traditional organizations, however, do have access to lots and lots of data. But like what you mentioned, this high-value data is not actually converted to something that they can create value out of, right? And this is a great tool to fight against disaggregation, disintermediation, because you could have your experience for the last 50 years is converted into digital asset that you can reuse, which is, I think, super powerful, right? Which I get super excited about.
Interesting, that idea of analog data. I'd never really thought about it before. Do either one of you have a sense at what's the percentage of analog data versus digital data in an organization?
Jeff, I think at a higher level, we don't have accurate numbers. And I think what's really interesting is it depends on the industry. Every industry is different. But I'm going to paint a high level picture, right? Some ballparks, right? Say like, in the retail industry, right, there is, and this is true across every industry, there is data that they are in the organization that the organization does not even know it's high value data, like what Chris mentioned. And then there is data the organization has already recognized it as high value data, but that data has not been converted into. So I think that's probably about 10-15% of the organization, right? This is the recognized portion. Right, the unrecognized portion of data that they have, that they're sitting on in some warehouse or in some archive, that is probably in the upper 30-40%.
Wow.
Right. So you have to think about it in those two lenses. And it gets very interesting because as traditional organizations are facing a lot of competition among themselves with the power of digital transformation, and also with newcomers who are disintermediating and disaggregating. This data is super critical. So I think the organization think about in two of the lenses. Look at their existing data that they've already recognized that's high value and that got to get converted to digital. So the machine learning and AI and models can continue to run. And then there is also have a open mind and an analysis to figure out what's out there that I have over the last 50 years of my business that is super unique, that I've learned, that I can use for my advantage. Because as retail, what's really interesting is even though there's a lot of early commerce and direct-to-consumer brands in this space, over the last hundreds of years, retailers have learned a lot. They know their consumers, they know the transitions, they know how to attract consumers and sell to them in a physical store and a location, and have all these massive moving parts. Retail always amazes me because you have so many millions of moving parts and you have to still run a business with the margins. And it's brilliant. But so I think there is so much learning out there that has happened in the past. It may have changed. Trends would have evolved, but there's a lot of learning in the past. And I think there should be a way and a methodology to capture a lot of that.
Is this a long-term play, or at a certain point, Brian, do you envision us being out of the analog data business?
No, I think what's interesting is, let me take that question first, but then I'll also get Chris's perspective as well. But I think what happens is there is a high volume play in the beginning for a few years, right? I would say like a 10-year horizon or something. And then there would continue to be a long tail because organizations are always going to have this long tail. The long tail may be not a heavy volume, but there will always be an ongoing long tail. That's how I look at it, right? Because the heavy volume plays to rushing to digital and trying to get everything ready so they could go in front of their customers and have all the business processes and the internal processes ready. So that's the heavy volume play. But over the years, as organizations begin to recognize data that they have not even realized that is still analog, and also fixing their processes, optimizing their processes, there will always continue to be a long tail. Chris, what are your thoughts? Do you feel the same?
I agree. This is not going to be a popular thought, I think, with a lot of your audience, because I've had this debate being through the lens of Ripcord with a lot of people. Paper's dead, right? Paper's dead. Paper's gone. Paper's not going to be here much longer, even if it is here. And I think that's true to a great extent. I think that obviously companies are looking to create more automated processes, but that automation comes with a lot of learning. That automation, it also introduces risk. And in this case, I think some industries are going to be very quick to adopt and move to 100% digital processes. And at that point, Ripcord still has a lot of work that I think we would still do in government sector, that we would still do in and across a lot of industries. But in terms of like retail and commerce space, I think the rest of my lifetime, which I'm an older guy now, but I certainly feel the rest of our lifetime, this is still going to be we are living in the world on the cusp of change. That change, I think, is still decades long before every industry across legislation and compliance drivers completely automates and goes 100% digital.
Even 10 years is a lifetime in this industry. So there is
a lot to go, right, Chris?
There's a lot of work to do. I when I hear you talk, Chris, I laugh because in a previous career, I was a facilities manager. So I know exactly the racks and racks of paper documents that were dumped in our warehouses over the years. So I think of that, and it's a mess. They're just documents dumped in boxes, jammed up into the upper racks. Yep. God knows if anybody ever needed to access. We were saving that for whatever reason. It's every warehouse person's nightmare to have to be responsible for all that. So I can.
And look at that stuff. It's not all financial records, legal records, manufacturing records. A lot of it is intellectual property in and around a lot of these organizations and industry that we work with. That intellectual property has a value, has a monetary value. And in this way, how do you preserve information as well? I think to some extent, AI is going to get us so far. Human-assisted AI today is going to get us so far. And I'm not a technologist, but the reading I do of what CIOs are being marketed today, it's the dawn of unassisted AI is upon us too. That is going to require a lot of trusted libraries of data to get that horsepower that unassisted AI programs of the future are going to need to transact with. And in this case, the work we're doing today, I think, is extremely compelling. It's really necessary part of the journey and the transformation in the journey of digital transformation.
You said something interesting. Let's back up a little bit. Assisted AI versus unassisted AI. That's actually a new term for me. Do you want to unpack what you mean by that?
I think so. I think Brian might be more versed in this area than I am.
Or either one of you guys, I'll throw it open. So Brian, is that a new term? Every time I talk to you, Brian, I have a whole list of new terms I have to learn. So what is assisted versus unassisted?
Pandora box here. Today, we still have software that needs a human to program, to do stuff. And that software is dependent on human data that fed into it. But where do you think the industry is going, Brian, with unassisted AI?
No, absolutely. Chris, like you said, because as data gets better and better, there is algorithms are automatically learning, right, from the data, right? And then you are getting to a point where algorithms actually can optimize themselves. And they can continue to learn more. And today, AI is used already to stitch gaps on data that's already not there. Like we talked a lot about synthetic domain transfers of data, like learning from data from one domain, transferring it back into another. So this is actually getting better and better. And then AI algorithms are optimizing themselves to actually give birth to new data and fix gaps, and also get themselves better to also find methods to collect data. So a lot of different things are happening in this whole unassisted AI space, right? The other is also building large sets of pre-vocabulary and data, like what the GPT project has done, the GPT-2, GPT-3 projects have done, where you're building a kind of a step towards going towards like more general AI that has a very large set of learning that has happened in the past. So this is all getting super interesting. But what's really interesting is the growth is exponential. And this is an exponential growth. And we are going to see more and more of this in the near future. And guess what? It's going to happen faster and sooner than we think it's going to happen. Right? So that's why you got to be ready to get all your ducks in a row and get data ready.
So when I hear the term exponential growth, that's as an analyst, as somebody that has to forecast markets, that gets interesting. But that then also means, from a retail perspective, what does that mean for capabilities inside a retailer? What do they have to anticipate? How do they prepare for this?
So I think what's going to happen is I would think about it in two different lenses, right? The first lens is to say, what is your consumer going to expect of you? So what it means is today, when a consumer, and we've spoken about this previously, like when a consumer goes to a digital website, an e-commerce site, they expect the site to know who they are and understand and recommend, do retargeting, everything, to know everything about you. The consumer expects, and as a consumer, Brian expects to know the site to know everything about Brian, everything about Chris, everything about Jeff, right? I'm not going to fill in my prior information. Everything you got to do. So there's a lot of table stake expectations that is being built in the consumer's mind. So that's one thing that the retailer has to constantly compete. So that means recommendations. That means personalization. That means contextualization, right? Because today, if you go to a site, they can personalize for you. But guess what? I've already came from a vacation. I'm not going to go for a vacation for the next 3 months or whatever. I wish I could go in 3 months. But the thing is, but if you go to ad website, they'll still be retargeting you for Hawaii vacations. Mm-hmm. So how do you know that at this given moment, Brian's need is different from the same Brian 2 days ago? So contextualization of AI is going to become table stake, right? So that's from the consumer lens, right? What do I need to do to satisfy my consumer? Then there is the other lens on the other side, which is basically, do I have the core capabilities from AI, data, and within my organization to run my business, right? Apart from what the consumers want. Is my financial systems ready? Is my supply chain ready? I mean, as autonomous vehicles are coming, my supply chain's getting autonomous. Or as more and more self-learning AI and contract management is happening, a lot of the contract negotiation and vendor management is going to become autonomous. So all that you have to deal with. Security, with all the attacks that we're having today. How do I build systems in AI? Is my information security platform with the right level of data and AI? So it's going to become a 360-degree view that they have to take. And there is a lot to catch up and there's a lot to go, right? And in a field that is constantly evolving.
So is there a checklist of what skill sets need to be in place, let's say by 2025? Who are these people that are making all these determinations around AI? Are these just software engineers like you, Brian, or is it a different skill set? Do retailers need to be hiring new functionality? Do they need to be creating new roles?
Absolutely. Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
A little bit, because I was going to say it's the natural progression of things, Jeff. To be honest with you, it's years ago you drove a manual vehicle and then you went to an automatic car and it became standard, right? The evolution of that became, well, now we've got Tesla and they've got level 1 or level 2 autonomous driving. I don't actually have to hold the steering wheel anymore. The evolution of that is a car eventually is not going to have a steering wheel at all. It'll just pick you up and then take you to your destination. This is progressive steps. And I think, that's where I opened Pandora box to talk about today. We've got human assisted AI. The AI still asks you, is this right? Is this okay? Can you confirm? It's asking you to confirm and make decisions. It's not making decisions for you and it's not creating technology for you. But where it's going, it will start to do those things. But how it will get there is with libraries of data. And so it's this kind of evolution story, if you will. I use the car as an analogy, but I think it's appropriate. Once upon a time, they were manual, then they went automatic. Now they're driving themselves. Eventually, they won't have a steering wheel.
Yeah, but in an organization, there has to be some human that has some capability to say yay or nay or turn it on or turn it off. The Tesla example is interesting. It's an amazingly complex vehicle that's becoming less complex for the human to drive, but there's somebody at Tesla that is developing that and controlling that. So I guess I'll redirect the question. Who in a retail organization has to sit on top of unassisted AI? I assume somebody has to. And what are those skill sets that those people need? And are those skill sets available in the organization today? Or is it a new person that needs to evolve, a new role that needs to evolve?
Interesting question, Jeff. I think what happens is that, it is the existing organization, but they have to create subsets internally, right? When internet came in the 90s, you actually had CIOs, and then CIOs actually had to have somebody who's running internet technology alone. So that sort of evolution is going to happen, where in the last 10 years, we've seen the role of chief digital officers coming in to run digital consumer side of the house. Some of the retailers have actually even seen who are actually looking for chief AI officers. CAO. You don't have to go that extreme, but the idea is there has to be leaders within the CIO's organization or the CDO's organization who actually understand AI and data, right? Sometimes, so it's evolving in a number of ways. Every organization is doing it differently. There is no correct formula per se. We are seeing scenarios where like the CIO's organization is evolving into adding the skill sets, leaders in AI, leaders with data leaders. And also the big data has been around for quite a lot of time. So retail has ramped up in staffing in this area, leaders who are actually looking at data per se. So I think data, AI, and also transformation, digital in general. So these are 3 roles that roll into a CIO. In other organizations, these roles have actually rolled up onto a CMO, especially being very more consumer focused, right? Because as the consumer needs are much, much higher. So within those teams, there will be AI experts that need to get hired, because a lot of retailers have already ramped up for data per se, but they need to add up at the next evolution of this as leaders and workforce that can actually provide capabilities for AI. So that part has to happen. Then as the five forces go penetrate deeper and deeper, there will be more workforce that needs to get added for IoT. And then today, if you look at retailers, most of them, or not most of them, some of them have innovation teams. So the startup side of the force is also somewhat interesting.
So interesting. I heard you roll that responsibility across 2 or 3 different organizations. Certainly the CIO makes sense. That's a technical person. Chief Marketing Officer can or can't be a highly technical person. I'm wondering if for all the future CMOs out there, if they need to get up to speed on AI in a big hurry. And the answer probably is yes. Probably every executive. If they don't understand what AI is and the potential, that's probably an area of learning that they need to take on pretty quickly, if not already.
And they're doing it now, right? They're doing it through e-commerce. They're doing it through chat bots. In every kind of way, they're already taking those steps. Every industry. And if they're not taking those steps, then the major retailers like Toys R Us, no surprise, I think it was a missed opportunity for a company like a Toys R Us to shut their doors. I think they recently got a new investor. I don't know. It could be way off from this. But I like the idea that they didn't compete with all the numerous online competitors suddenly. And here's an example of a company, I think, that missed the bar on being progressive in that way. And there are other examples of mega giant companies that are, finding themselves struggling because they're not coming to market against all their competitors in the space. I think Brian talks a lot about the 5 forces of innovation that his company brings to market. I like to look at it through the customer lens of it's the 5 forces of competitiveness that you need in the e-commerce space. And if you're not innovating, well, the expression in Silicon Valley is innovate or die. But if you're not innovating, you may be not keeping up with your competitors today are not the big box store across the street. It's Mary Jo's home online business that competes with you now because they have platforms to be competitive with everyone. And the companies and the organizations today, I think how we got on this rabbit hole, Jeff, is that the companies are taking steps to get there. And where is the there? We think that there is, in some cases, technology is going to be making decisions for your business. And that's probably a good thing in and around a lot of your cost centers where you have thresholds of approval process and things that need to happen. Can technology maybe help make those decisions on behalf of my company? Critical things I'm still going to put in front of a human, perhaps, like my CFO or whomever. But those trends are happening now. We are seeing the CMOs and all these other executives across their BUs in every organization of every industry looking for technology, looking for the horsepower they need to make more decisions faster in the most efficient way. Or if, in this case, I'm a CMO, I want customer data, demographic, and all the other things. And then I need something, I need that e-commerce store. And then there's a great deal of AI, as you all know today, built into those stores.
One of the other things, Jeff, we are also seeing is that this whole tracking, right? What I mean by that is that typically a lot of these use cases and needs about what a company ought to do starts somewhere at a board level question in a meeting. Some board member says, so what about launch this? Are you thinking about this? Or this company got acquired? This startup got acquired for so many millions of dollars? Are you thinking about this space? And that's where this conversation starts. And then the CEO naturally turns it to his general manager who runs the business, or the CMO, or the marketing head, and turns to ask the question, are you ready for it? So that's where CMOs and the marketing leaders are naturally looped in and sort of the first responders to this question, right? And then the CIO gets rolled a couple of days later because of the nature of the problem. And then like you said, this is an area a lot of CMOs have to be ready and also well-versed, especially with the use cases, not with the technology so much, but also the applicability of the technology across these use cases and what others are doing, what are the best practices, and what has worked and what hasn't worked.
Yeah, it's funny, Brian. I used to get asked all the time by retail executives, so what are you guys at Gartner going to yap about so I know what to be ready for? because we would write some thought-provoking piece, and then hopefully every CEO reads that, or at least becomes available of what we were saying in 2000, 2002, 2003, and then the CIO has to respond to that. So that's a bread and butter for every analyst to throw out that thought leadership piece that starts a lot of questions. However, the people having to answer those questions did not think that was as funny as I did. So it's a challenge when you've got to respond to something that the CIO CEO just came up with. So where do we go with all this, Brian? What's your role in working with these startups in this whole digital transformation space? Where are we going with this?
See, I think the place where this is all going is we are going into a hyper-personalized, right? A place where businesses know the consumer more deeply, and a place where, a lot of friction today with technology is going to be removed. Technology still has friction. Right? At one point, the friction was people don't know how to use phones and computers and all that stuff. But that's changing. But today, the friction is, how do I go get this service? How do I interact with this retailer? How do I interact with this voice service? This retailer have a voice application at home. And also, there is heavy competition, especially with the big Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, the GAFA companies, sort of becoming the gateway. And if you look at search today, right, Google's the gateway for search. And Amazon is slowly becoming the gateway for your home with their voice, Alexa, and all those applications. So now retailers are in a place where they have to really compete to be a part of these touch points. And how do I actually be a part of every touch point of this consumer? And how do I be a part of the day in a life of this consumer in a much bigger way, non-transactional way? And how do I leverage the technology arsenal of AI, IoT, blockchain startups at my disposal to get there? And I think that's where I think this gets.
As an analyst that covers a space, as somebody that writes about it, and somebody having a lot of fun talking and chasing down all these new innovations, it's awesome. I still have to wonder if I'm on the receiving end of all this, how nervous I must be about what I need to address in the next 3 or 4 years. Chris, any parting thoughts on what retail and CPG should be doing to get ready for this digital transformation time?
They need to innovate, right? They need to think differently. The consumer is also far more educated than they've ever been in the past. It's not just that your competitors are everywhere. The world has become a small place because of the internet, right? So now my competition is not just North American companies. It's if I'm in a retail space, it's anywhere on the planet. They can ship you a product, and the consumers are aware. They're smart. They can go out. They can go to market and do web search as I can and get educated about the competitive offering of a product I'm researching. And in this case, the retail organization, I think, has a responsibility to know their customer. And know your customer doesn't just mean where do they shop and what are they looking for and what's exciting about some product on your shelf. It's, I think, also looking competitively at the demographic of my customers and what all the whole household of products that person wants and needs. And then how does my organization benefit from data that I can capture about these end profiles, and how do I market? I think if your audience today is likely actively procuring and pursuing a lot of technology in and around a lot of the areas of business that we discussed today, commerce and finance and et cetera. But for my parting thought, I think this is necessary. If the organizations are not making strides in this way, I think that they're going to find themselves with more competitors than they accounted for, than they were prepared for, and they're going to lose revenue. So that's my last thought. Innovate or go bust. You know?
As a longtime resident of Silicon Valley, we all live by it. And unfortunately, a lot of retailers have realized that too. So those are, I think, probably sound words to cut it off at. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. Brian, I'm glad you're back from Hawaii. I got tired of seeing all those fantastic pictures. So I'm glad you're back laboring in the office. Welcome back. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Chris. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode. For more info, refer to the pod notes below. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps us grow. I'm your host, Jeff Roster, analyst at large. If you want to connect, follow us on Twitter at JeffPR or at Brian Sathianathan, or connect with us on LinkedIn. visit my website at roster.retail.com or Brian's at Iterate.ai. Until next time, stay safe and have a great week.